I don't want to just focus on, annotating a poem basically, and you guys all just watch me, because you do a lot of that with school. I imagine, for many of you, you want to actually crack down on the exam technique part of it. You might feel like when you see a poem, you know what to kind of pick out, you know what to look for, you know that you have to say something about rhyme, something about rhythm, etc. So yeah, I want to focus more on kind of like looking at the assessment objectives. And also there are lots of different resources online that I thought many of you probably haven't looked at that would be really helpful. So if you haven't joined me in one of these before, basically you'll probably want a pen and paper or somewhere else that you're taking notes. I will make notes on the whiteboard. Let's just talk quite generally, first of all, about poems of the decade. If you are unsure which decade we're referring to, it's a bit of a random one. It's 2002 to 2011, technically. And many of you will know that there aren't specific context marks available for the question. So obviously I'm going to go through, what is available. But yeah, there's no AO3 specific, you have to bring in the context like you will with section B. So what does that mean for us here? Does it mean that we don't bring in anything to do with the time period? No. It just means that we don't kind of have to bring in a large amount of it in order to sort of get those marks of contextualizing the poems. We're focusing more on things like the techniques, comparing the methods, making arguments, making interpretations. And then the section B is where you can show off that you really read into the Romantic period, you really read into that particular poet. When it comes to poems of the decade, or dystopian, or Gothic, or drama, they really want you to engage with whatever the sort of title is, let's say, of that section you're completing. You should never kind of ignore it and just think like, oh, well, yeah, that these are just plonked together from a specific era, and I don't really need to say much about that. What is it about this decade that seems to inform so many of the poems? One thing I would say is you'll probably want to, at some point, if you haven't already, I know some of you are at different stages, some of you have looked at all of the poems, some of you haven't looked at all of the poems, but I would definitely think about making some sort of table at some point where you just consider, okay, what themes are actually explored here? This one deals with quite a specific political event, for instance, in the case of 9/11. This one's, uses a really kind of like working class urban setting to sort of make its points. Some themes that you might say is, yeah, just kind of like modern life. And I'm sure you've all got lists of these already, but this is just a recap. Things like identity, settings, which may be urban, natural, and kind of responses to just what does the sort of like landscape look like now. We've also said political events, violence as well. We've got World War II allusions in here. We've got commentary on guns as well, definitely relationships. So power dynamics, gender politics, etc., etc. There's so much we can say, and I don't want you to shy away from these points, because making these points is going to feed into all three of the assessment objectives. These are going to provide your links. This is where you're going to get those marks for being creative and personal and perceptive, and all of those lovely terms that we're obviously going for in band 5. One point I also wanted to make, because many of you will feel pretty confident with the poems of the decade, but it's the unseen that you're really here to sort of work on. How do you get better at unseen? Well, you need to expose yourself to them pretty regularly, don't you? Don't wait for the odd unseen that your teacher gives you in a mock, and then wonder why every single time it feels like a new experience and you're not confident with it yet. Find poems, find unseen poems. If you've got a poet in here in your anthology already, look into another poem that they've written, for instance, and that could be a good way of accessing unseens, which are still from this period. Because I've been a little bit naughty today And the poem, the unseen poem that I've chosen, it is by Simon Armitage, who is within your anthology. But I have gone for an earlier poem of his. So I just want to disclaimer that. I've chosen a poem from 1993, which is ever so slightly out of the poems of the decade. So yeah, do try and stick as close to your era, basically, when you are finding your own unseens. So let's have a very quick discussion about or surrounding the assessment objectives. I know this is not the most thrilling thing in the world, so I will keep it brief, but we have got a fairly straightforward question here in terms of there's 30 marks available. And you've got 3 assessment objectives, which are all equally weighted, for those of you who didn't sort of know that. So AO1 is all about being creative and personal and original in your response, and also being coherent. There's no use trying to go for a really creative, original response and, oh, this could mean that and that could mean that. And then it's a complete headache to read and no one can make any sense of it. It's a balancing act, isn't it? I don't want you to all write really safe pedestrian responses, and, you know, because you're trying really hard to be coherent and clear. But at the same time, I don't want a load of wacky responses that go all over the place and I can't make sense of it when I'm reading it. It's a balancing act, and it takes being experimental at this point. You know, you do still have time to be experimental in your homeworks, for instance. You should be pushing boundaries a bit. And then if your teacher tells you, okay, you're losing clarity here, you're losing focus here, that's when you know, okay, I need to rein that in a little bit. Maybe I should go for less ideas next time, for instance. So do think of this part of the year as still being quite like that. You're not in the exam hall yet, so you should be playing around with ideas. I don't want anyone to write really, really safe responses with this, because ultimately you're being given a golden opportunity, aren't you, with the unseen element, to be creative, to show that you don't need a teacher, you don't need poem analysis websites, you have your own insights. If you are finding them challenging, do not panic. That is very, very normal. Just do with it what you can. And remember, you're not being sorted in any way. It's not like, you know, Hogwarts sorting of like, you got the poem and this candidate didn't get the poem. They're not, you know, approaching it in that way. They just want you to come up with multiple interpretations and connections, importantly. So all of these work together. AO1, yeah, being accurate as well is important. If you are saying that something is like enchantment and it's not, or you're saying that something's there and it's not, that's going to impact your AO1. So don't think of these as being really, really separate. AO1 kind of infiltrates the others, if that makes sense. AO2 is all about engaging with this specific question and this paper actually as a poem. So that's one thing I really like about Edexcel, the fact that they do separate the forms. So you've got drama, prose, poetry, because it means that when you go into your exams, you know that day you've got to have your poetry hat on. And you know the other day you've got to have the drama hat on. And, you know, it makes it a little bit easier, doesn't it? You're not switching around quite so much. So when you do go into your poetry paper, what does that mean? It means we need to engage with these as they are, as poems. So remember, they are poems. So what does that actually mean, remembering that they're poems? It means that these are designed to be heard. And I think that's kind of new information for quite a few students. A lot of students sort of know that poetry exists, but they're not really sure where it came from. Poetry is the oldest form. They come from a kind of oral tradition, is what it's called, where you are passing information by word of mouth, and therefore the rhythms and the rhymes, etc., make it more memorable. So any elements relating to sounds and rhythms go for this, basically, as well as language. These are your formal techniques. You will notice sometimes with these poems that there isn't maybe a really set rhyme scheme, or maybe the structure's really irregular. Maybe there's a few stanzas and they're all different lengths, and the lines are different lengths, and maybe that makes you panic sometimes. You think, well, I don't really know what to say about that. But remember that not including structural regularity and sort of rhythms and rhymes, remember that is a choice as well. So whether you find something or whether you don't find something, that's, perfect for you because you've still got loads you can talk about, don't you? So formal techniques, really important to talk about. In terms of structure, this can be things like beginnings, middles, and ends. That is all structure as well. You could, of course, just think about like the stanzas, the lines, the lengths, etc. And then, of course, I'm not going to forget about language. That is all your lovely metaphors, etc. I'm not going to go through every single language device that you could obviously bring in. I'm sure you all feel pretty, comfortable with that. Is there a specific way we can structure a paragraph to ensure we cover all the objectives? That is a really good question. Do it in rough thirds. That's the best way of approaching this, basically, isn't it? So if you know that you've got 3 assessment objectives and they are all equally weighted, you know that roughly 33 point something percent of each paragraph should be dealing with that assessment objective. AO1 is all about kind of your insights, your inferences, making a point. It's all to do with how you're structuring it, how you're moving through your points in a really kind of like clear, elevated way. AO2 is where you're dealing with the methods. So that's showing an awareness of identifying methods and also considering their effects. And then AO4, which I haven't quite touched on yet, is all about, comparing them. So if you are noticing, if you look back over your old essays and you're like, oh, I wasn't really comparing them, I was just sort of talking about them separately, and then I just shoved similarly in the middle of my paragraph, that could be where your marks are going, So that's what I kind of want you to get out of today. I want you to sort of just realize that it's not a mark of your intelligence at all a lot of the time with English Lit. Many of you are very, very intelligent. And that's why it's really disappointing, isn't it, to get like 15 out of 30 on an essay? Because you might think, well, no, I understood the poems really well and I thought I wrote a really lovely essay. But if you don't play the game of the assessment objectives and their weightings, you're kind of tying the examiner's hands, aren't you? And I want to talk about now the comparative thing. I've kind of touched on it already, but yeah, this means you want it to be fully integrated. They will notice if you aren't dealing with them kind of equally, let's say. Doesn't need to be mathematically 50-50, but if you are someone who hates the unseen poem, because obviously that's the one you can't choose, everyone's given the same unseen, and then you choose which anthology poem you want to go with of the 2 you're given. So there's not a lot of choice, but you have a little bit of choice. Yeah, if you absolutely hate the unseen and you think the best way of getting past that is to try and avoid it and wow them with your analysis of the poem of the decade, that's not going to work. The examiner is absolutely going to notice that. So yeah, deal with them equally, integrate your analysis regularly. So maybe once in the point sentence of your paragraph, for instance, and a couple of times throughout. And then again in concluding. So something like that, because I know that someone's going to ask me that question, how often should I be comparing within my paragraph? Just as and when you see fit. There's no magic sort of, number for that, essentially. Just as long as you feel like you are integrating it and you're not going with what I said before, which is kind of like, starting with one quite separately and then just one little word to join them together and then going into the next. And if you have been doing that and you've been finding it hard to break into the 20s, again, hopefully this sort of causes you to note what could be going on there. Now, a little trap, and this is the final thing I'll say in assessment objectives, a little trap that students could fall into is just comparing the what. So what do I mean by that? It means that you take two poems and you think, okay, great, they're about family relationships. Let me just find my cookie cutter matches. Oh, in this one, the parent dies. This one, the parent dies. Thank goodness. I've got a paragraph. And that's just the wrong way to approach it. You know, you shouldn't be approaching it in terms of trying to find similarities or even differences in just what the poems are about. You're supposed to also be comparing the how. So remember to compare the methods. You should, in theory, have limitless points to make when you consider that you can also think about methods. And comparing means looking for similarities and differences, or, it's either, isn't it? Now, I want to look at some poems today. As I was saying before, I have been sneaky and I've taken one from slightly outside the poem of the decade sort of like range, and that is going to be your unseen today. That is your unseen. I apologize for the hyperlink. It's just from where I've copied it from. And today, again, the purpose of today is not going to be just watching me annotate these at all. I will, of course, talk about a few different like angles where I could take this if I was aiming for a band 5, which I'm sure we all are. But yeah, I'm not going to be going line by line because I think that would be deathly boring and unnecessary. So, Effects by Alan Jenkins, for those of you who have done it, which hopefully is everyone, that is your anthology poem. Seems like part of the reason why they did have a sort of disjointed relationship was due to a kind of social class difference. And you might think, how can they be of a different social class when that's their mother? But, you can be raised, by a working class parent, and then you kind of have the tools in your own life to achieve social mobility and kind of enter into the middle class, for instance, which seems like, that's been the case here for this speaker. Harmonium by Simon Armitage is a different poem, but obviously it deals with a similar theme. I've asked us to think about parent-child relationship and to start just scribbling down, okay, this is how I'd approach this. But I want you to think about what I've said already about what you should be looking for, what the assessment objectives are really asking of you, and also what makes these both poems of the decade, even though, as I said, the Harmonium is actually 1993. I have put some key points at the side there as well. These are just some things I sort of blurted out as I was prepping this lesson. So if any of you are feeling completely lost with how to approach a poem, I have put some key points at the side there. The poem that I've chosen, hopefully you can sort of see why I've chosen it. I think it's a perfect example of where you'll get a poem that doesn't necessarily have like cookie cutter matches you can make. The death of the parent is alluded to as an inevitability in this poem, but it hasn't happened yet, and it doesn't have quite the same tone of kind of like regret, etc. that Effects by Alan Jenkins does have potentially. So Harmonium, it centers around this central symbol of the organ, and it looks at, in the first couple of stanzas, this idea of kind of like the organ having fulfilled its purpose and being quite aged, and and being disused as well. It says it was gathering dust in a shadowy porch and it was due to be bundled off to the skip. So this incredible musical instrument that's brought people together for seemingly a long time and has been enjoyed and used and has become this, or was this kind of central feature of the church, is now completely used up and it's ready to go. And you could see that, couldn't you, as perhaps a metaphor that reflects people. People kind of have a little song and then ultimately we all die, don't we? So I think it's a really kind of beautiful poem in that way. And it feels almost sacrilegious to just bundle it off to the skip. With this idea of the organ still being, like beautiful, is then, of course, revisited or properly explained to us, I suppose, in the penultimate stanza. Its hummed harmonics still struck a chord. For 100 years, that organ had stood by the chorister's stalls, where father and son, each in their time, had opened their throats and gilded finches like high notes had streamed out. that's quite dramatic, isn't it? As an image. And of course, it then sort of starts to play into this idea of parent-child relationships, which is what the question was about. So do make sure as you are going through annotating your poem, you are staying very close to the question. Answering the question is very good advice. You might think it's very self-evident advice, but you'll be surprised how easy it is, especially in an exam setting, especially when you've been given something unseen. You'll be surprised how easy it is to start straying away. We've got to bring everything back to parent-child relationships. And here it's really clear, isn't it? There's many things that seem to unite people in this community that's being presented. You've got religion, and praise and song. What does it say that the organ's now being bundled out to the skip? What does that say about the breakdown of maybe even spirituality in modern society? What does it say about the breakdown of community? We're not sure if it's being replaced with another one. That's an ambiguity of the poem, isn't it? Through his own blue cloud of tobacco smog, with smoker's fingers and dottle thumbs, he comes to help me cart it away. I mean, even that is quite a charming image, isn't it? Father and son helping one another. This had always been an object that had united father and son. And even when it's not being used to fulfill its function anymore, it's still uniting them. And the father coming to help the son, it speaks to, doesn't it, like parental love, perhaps. And then it's laid flat on its back, and it really does kind of create that image of a funeral procession. So I'm not really surprised that the father says what he says. He says it'll be him next, which is sort of using dark humor, isn't it, to convey a sort of uncomfortable or taboo truth. And how would we say that the son or the speaker responds to this? Not not with great comfort, I would say. I, being me, then mouth in reply some shallow or sorry phrase or word, too starved of breath to make itself heard. Um, that idea sort of chokes them up, doesn't it? And it's about kind of having to confront in unexpected kind of moments, everyday mundane moments, a universal truth, that your parents will die, or that you will die, or that everything dies. It's this whole poem about decay and death. So sorry that's not a very cheerful one for you all this morning. In terms of how we'd actually then talk about effects, what sort of things could we bring in here? Well, first of all, I think the structure of the poems is actually quite comparable. You might think, what is she talking about? One of them's got 4 stanzas and one of them's just one single stanza. What's comparable about that? Well, structure goes into far more than just counting stanzas or counting lines. I think in each of these, they both avoid, for instance, using a standard sort of regular rhyme scheme, but there are elements of, small rhymes. For instance, word heard at the end here of Armitage's poem. That's just one example of a rhyming couplet. And then see and me at the end of Alan Jenkins. And I think they both end, due to that use of rhyme at the end, I think they both end with this sense of some sort of closure. No one has to agree with me, by the way, on anything. This is poetry, this is interpretation. So, if you have a completely different idea, that is absolutely fine. It doesn't mean you're wrong or I'm right. But yeah, I think, Effects by Alan Jenkins is all about kind of the speaker trying desperately to sort of reach a sense of closure. They've gone back to see their mother, obviously, when it's already too late. And they are retracing that history. They are owning up and sort of internally taking accountability, aren't they, for the ways in which they failed as a son and the reasons for why that might have been. And, ultimately that is the absolute final closure of life, isn't it? To see your dead relative, to have their effects. And the next step is, burial or cremation, etc. So in a sense, it's a real physical closure. It's the last face to face, and it's amusing, isn't it, on the finality of that death. Now there's a similar sort of sense, again because of the rhyming couplet at the end, of closure with harmonium. But ultimately, it's a bit more ambiguous, isn't it? You know, the death hasn't happened yet. They don't say anything. With effects, I think that, you know, we are supposed to get that sense of, okay, they've reached some sort of finality, some sort of closure at the end. With harmonium, I think they try and force a closure. You know, they clearly don't want to talk about that. That's why they just mouth in reply some shallow or sorry phrase. You know, they don't really sincerely engage, do they, with that concept of carrying their father's coffin. It's too much for them to sort of almost deal with in that moment. And so it's all about kind of silencing a topic, I would say, is how we're led to a closure there at the end. Now, in terms of imagery and with what I was saying earlier, yes, okay, there's no context marks, but you, of course, have to sort of be led by themes of poems of the decade. I think social class and community and sort of modern living and sort of the breakdown of community, etc., I think is really comparable in each of these. So if you already got down a note on that, well done. So hopefully you can all see that. I've made it quite ginormous, so hopefully you can. It's off to the right of the screen. And I just want to pick out a few key things here. So it ranges from 8 out of 30 to 22 out of 30. I mean, 22 out of 30, if you do go ahead and read that essay later, I'm sure you can see why it did lose 8 marks. It's not the most thrilling thing you've ever seen. But yeah, at 8 marks, I just thought it was really interesting that they say it lacks a real sense of the texts as poems. So that linked to something that I've said, I guess, a few times now, which is have your poetry hat on. When you walk into this exam, it doesn't matter if you read poems in your own time. It doesn't matter if you love poetry or enjoy poetry. Just pretend to. Just make sure that you are really regularly engaging with poemy language. This was something I certainly had to fake. I enjoy poetry now, but when I was doing it in my A-levels, I didn't really. It was something I only engaged with in the context of school. So it came down to just faking it a little bit and remembering to bring in things like, you know, caesura and jargon, rhythm, rhyme. The second one, it says the structure improves during the course of this response. Now, why does that happen? I could put that down most likely to a lack of planning. So that is one of the things I would definitely say here. Make sure you take the time to plan this. Make sure you have a really nice, strong introduction where you've laid out with some finality, you know, what you would like to go into. I would say for most of you, you are going to be doing either 2 or 3 main body paragraphs. So make sure you've thought about what's actually going to go in them right at the beginning. Don't decide as you go along. Then the final one, this is script 4 that I'm now looking at. It just says that it shows discriminating understanding through controlled evaluative elements, and the AO4 is well developed. So I put as one of my little top tips over here to remember to be evaluative. You know, it doesn't ask you to what extent do you agree. So you might think, oh, phew, I don't have to convince anyone here of anything. I don't have to be debatey. I can just sort of, you know, fling out my ideas in a sort of you decide way. No, you always have to be convincing and persuasive in your writing. Does that mean you need to say, this is what this poem means and there's absolutely no other way of reading it? No, you are going to be tentative, but you need to be convincing and forceful at the same time. Again, it's a balancing act. I can't remember what I was referring to as a balancing act at the beginning. Was I saying you have to be creative, but also coherent? Now, there's one final thing I want to look at before I do a bit of a Q&A. Sorry, it's a little bit similar, but hopefully you're finding these useful to look at. Have a very quick read over this. Again, this is just, you know, the one that I just showed you were just some very basic remarks relating to a few different papers. This is like a full examiner report. This is what they said that they found that year. And then Edexcel have very kindly put together a list of things for you to look out for. But for some reason, only 1% of students seem to find themselves on these sorts of websites with this information, which is a shame because it is for you. Now, there's one final thing I want to say. It can be really easy to end up going over time with this particular question because candidates can see an unseen poem, rush into annotating it to death, struggle to sort of like pull together their arguments, their paragraphs, etc. And basically, it could just be a lot. And then they can end up eating into the time that's supposed to be available for the next section. So don't let that happen. Try to be really kind of, strict with yourself, I suppose, when it comes to approaching your planning phase for this question. I don't want you to go into the exam and annotate your poem to death, for instance, before you've chosen what question you're going to do. Always choose your question first. So that might look like having a quick read of the unseen poem. So holding back on annotations, no annotations, just a quick read. Then you look at your questions and you say, okay, which one am I going to go for? Which theme do I feel more inspired by? Which anthology poem do I feel I could talk about in a more productive, interesting way? And then you think about, okay, well, I want these paragraphs to exist, let's say. And then you do your annotations. I know that all sounds like it's quite a few steps and, you want to just get into annotating the poem. But I always say in all of my sessions that can feel productive, having a lovely, fully annotated 10 highlighter colors, all over the page, picking out millions of metaphors and, structural features will feel productive, but it is a bit of a trap. It isn't necessarily productive if you then have to create order out of that chaos. It is way better to think of what would my paragraphs be and what's my kind of thesis here, or, what's my angle going to be here? And then you go into just picking out what you what you need, basically. So for me, for instance, final thing I'll say before questions, if I was looking at these two poems and I had to talk about parent-child relationships, I might talk about how both poets use a kind of central physical symbol or symbol. Can't really see what I'm typing, so apologies. Symbol or metaphor. So in the case of Jenkins, we've got the effects, which is actually like the physical rings, and also the body, to be morbid about it. We've got a body here, that is a physical thing. And then in the case of Armitage, we've obviously got the organ. Sorry, typing's going out the window. And then I might talk about how they're used for different sort of purposes. Again, thinking about how there's a difference here in terms of like, it's too late for Jenkins's speaker to sort of do anything. For Armitage's speaker, he can do something and is doing something. Clearly it does have a relationship with his parent and they're on jovial sort of terms, clearly. And yet there is a lack of kind of emotional vulnerability there, because obviously there's things that they can't talk about, or maybe the parent is reaching out, but it seems like the child is leaning away rather than leaning in, if that makes sense, because obviously it makes them uncomfortable to think of their parent dying. So discuss how these are used for different sort of purposes. So note there how I've kind of pulled out one similarity in terms of their methods, but I've talked about some difference within there as well. So that's just one example. I also might want to talk about kind of like tone in each of them when it comes to death or attitudes towards death. I think there's elements of avoidance in each of them. In effects, they remember that their mother had said, please don't leave, but of course I left. It's that idea of kind of like, they're only facing the music, again, sorry for the pun, in effect, when it's already happened. And before that, they were clearly avoiding the fact that it was coming and it was going to happen. And maybe you could say that there's a bit of a similarity there with Armitage. Another example, just for those of you who are thinking, maybe you have your 3 paragraphs already, but some of you might be thinking, I've absolutely no idea what paragraphs I might go for here. A third paragraph I might think about might be like modern life and how settings could be used to sort of show that. You've got the setting almost of the kitchen that starts off, effects. And then also kind of like hospital settings, and wards, all of these settings, the domestic setting of being at home, that place of sort of isolation and escapism with sort of modern technology, TV, etc. And then also, we already talked earlier, didn't we, in Armitage, in Harmonium, about this setting of the church and how it's a kind of, it's an arena for connection, but also what's happening to that connection is something kind of falling or breaking away. Because I'm not an organist, I'm not an expert, but it seems like this organ just hasn't been maintained very well, has it? Why didn't it have like a cover on it, for instance? It says it's got a softwood case, it's been sat in the sun, and it kind of looks like things could be replaced and fixed, like the holes that were worn in the treadles, but it hasn't been. So what does that say about modern life? Is this just a throwaway culture now? For instance, hopefully you've got a lot out of that and found that useful, and you feel a bit less scared, if any of you were feeling scared about this question.